Welcome back to Binge Guide, the next show, the podcast where we help you find your next movie obsession. I'm Andrew.
I'm Victoria.
And today we are diving into a movie that's creating quite a buzz, Screamboat.
Oh, yeah. This one hitting theaters on April 2nd.
April 2nd, yeah.
This one's got a hook that's both genius and maybe a little unsettling.
Okay.
You see, Screamboat takes inspiration from the 1928 animated short Steamboat Willie.
Right.
You know, the one that introduced the world to Mickey Mouse?
The one and only.
Exactly. And here's where things get interesting. That early version of Mickey Mouse entered the public domain.
Oh, wow.
In January of 2024, meaning anyone can use the character.
Oh, so it's free reign.
Yeah, it opens up a whole world of possibilities.
I can only imagine.
Some more terrifying than others.
Uh-oh.
And the filmmakers behind Screamboat definitely went for terrifying.
Okay.
Imagine this: a late-night ferry ride in New York City turns into a bloodbath.
Oh, no.
When a monstrous, murderous version of Steamboat Willie starts terrorizing the passengers.
So like someone took our childhood memories and spliced them with a slasher film.
Pretty much. And get this, the director is Stephen LaMorte. The same guy who turned the Grinch into a horror villain.
Oh, yeah.
In The Mean One back in 2022.
So he's kind of got a thing going on here.
He does. He seems to have a knack for taking beloved children's characters and twisting them into something dark and sinister.
Yeah, it's interesting. On one hand, it feels almost sacrilegious to mess with these iconic characters.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's also this morbid curiosity, like we can't help but wonder what happens when something innocent becomes corrupted.
Yeah, and with Steamboat Willie being public domain, it does raise questions about where the line is between like homage and exploitation.
It's true.
It'll be interesting to see how Screamboat navigates that.
Definitely. But let's move on to another element that's got people talking.
Yeah.
The casting of David Howard Thornton.
Yes!
As the titular Screamboat Willie.
As Screamboat Willie, the man who brought us Art the Clown and the Terrifier films.
Oh yes, if anyone can bring a murderous cartoon mouse to life, it's him.
Absolutely. There's a physicality to his acting that's both captivating and deeply unsettling. He conveys so much menace and intensity with just a look or a gesture.
I can only imagine.
I remember seeing some footage from MegaCon in Orlando where they previewed a clip.
Oh, wow.
And the fan reactions were wild.
So people are clearly excited to see what he does with his character.
They are.
And adding to the intrigue, Screamboat also features a few surprise cameos.
Oh, yes. Tell me more.
Tyler Posey from Teen Wolf, Brian Quinn of Impractical Jokers fame, and comedian Joe DeRosa, who you might recognize from Better Call Saul.
Wow, that's a pretty diverse lineup.
It is.
It makes you wonder how their comedic styles will play into this horror setting.
I know, right? Will they be victims, part of the fight against the murderous mouse, or just adding some comedic relief to the mayhem?
It's a mystery.
It is a mystery. The filmmakers are keeping those details very close to the chest.
Smart marketing.
Well, we'll have to wait and see how it all comes together when Screamboat hits theaters on April 2nd.
Can't wait.
Me neither.
Welcome back to Binge Guide. The next show, we're still aboard the Screamboat, charting the course of this highly anticipated horror comedy.
Yeah, it's a wild ride, that's for sure. I mean, who could have predicted that the next big horror icon would be Steamboat Willie?
It's definitely a bold move, and one that wouldn't be possible without that little mouse entering the public domain.
Right.
It's like a whole new frontier for filmmakers with all these classic characters, ripe for reimagining.
Speaking of reimagining, let's talk about the horror comedy aspect of Screamboat. You know, it's being marketed as both terrifying and funny. Do you think those two tones can really coexist?
I think it depends on the execution. You know, it's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
But it can be done. Look at Evil Dead 2 or Shaun of the Dead.
Oh, good examples.
They managed to blend gore and humor in a way that's both entertaining and thought-provoking.
That's true.
Yeah.
And LaMorte has already shown he's not afraid to push boundaries with The Mean One.
Yeah.
But this feels different.
Yeah.
You know, it's the Mickey Mouse we're talking about. Will audiences be willing to laugh at a character that's so deeply ingrained in our cultural consciousness?
That's a good question, a question that only time will answer. But I think there's a certain generation that grew up with these classic cartoons who might be ready to see them subverted.
Right.
To explore their darker side. There's a sense of irony and nostalgia that could really resonate.
Yeah, it's almost like a form of cultural deconstruction. We're taking these symbols of innocence and confronting them with our adult anxieties and fears.
Exactly, and Screamboat is doing it in a very visceral, over-the-top way.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's not forget the setting, the Staten Island Ferry.
Oh, yeah?
That adds a whole other layer to the potential for humor.
Right. Imagine the chaos of a typical commute, amplified by a murderous cartoon mouse.
Okay, now I'm picturing a bunch of exhausted commuters trying to make it home after a long day, and suddenly they're in a fight for their lives against Steamboat Willie.
That's a pretty funny image.
It's a recipe for some darkly comedic moments.
Absolutely. And remember those cameos we mentioned?
Oh, yeah.
Tyler Posey, Brian Quinn, and Joe DeRosa.
Yeah.
They each have a unique comedic sensibility that could really play off the absurdity of the situation.
I'm really curious to see how those cameos are woven into the story. Will they be playing heightened versions of themselves?
Right.
Will they have any awareness of the ridiculousness of the situation?
Yeah, it's a total mystery.
Yeah.
The possibilities are endless. They could be poking fun at horror tropes, or maybe even offering a meta commentary on the nature of public domain characters.
All right, before we get too carried away with speculation, let's circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the Staten Island Ferry.
Okay.
It's a very specific, iconic location.
It is.
Why do you think the filmmakers chose that setting?
Well, I think it adds a sense of grounded reality to the film.
Yeah?
You know,
Okay.
it's a place that most people can relate to, a symbol of everyday life in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And by placing this outlandish, cartoonish horror in that context, it creates a jarring contrast.
It's almost like they're saying, look, this could happen anywhere, even on your daily commute.
Which is a pretty terrifying thought when you think about it.
It plays into our deepest fears, right? The idea that the mundane can suddenly turn into a nightmare.
Totally. And let's not forget that the ferry they used for filming is actually owned by comedians Colin Jost and Pete Davidson.
Right, that little tidbit adds another layer of intrigue to the production.
Yeah.
You have to wonder if their comedic sensibilities had any influence on the film's tone, or if there were any inside jokes slipped in there.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what they were thinking when they agreed to let their ferry be used for a horror comedy about a murderous Steamboat Willie.
I know, and it makes me even more curious to see the final product. You know, it
Yeah.
feels like Screamboat is walking this tightrope between horror and comedy, nostalgia and subversion reality and absurdity.
It's definitely a high wire act, and it could go either way. It could be a brilliant genre-bending masterpiece, or it could be a complete train wreck.
That's the risk they're taking. But based on what we've seen so far, from the Red Band trailer to the casting choices, it seems like they're leaning into the chaos
Yeah.
and embracing the unexpected, and that's what makes it so exciting.
So for those of you listening who are intrigued by this bizarre blend of horror and comedy, what can you watch while you wait for Screamboat to hit theaters?
Well, we've already mentioned a few films that might pique your interest. Definitely check out LaMorte's previous work, The Mean One, to get a taste of his twisted style. And of course, you can't go wrong with classics like Evil Dead 2 and Shaun of the Dead, which really set the bar for the horror comedy genre.
And if you're curious about David Howard Thornton's unsettling talent, the Terrifier films will definitely give you a taste of what he brings to the table. Be warned, though those are not for the faint of heart.
Absolutely. But if you're looking for something a little more lighthearted with a touch of absurdist humor, I'd recommend Tucker and Dale vs. Evil.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
It's a hilarious take on the slasher genre with plenty of twists and turns.
And for something with a similar New York City vibe, check out CHUD. It's a classic 80s creature feature that takes place in the city's underground tunnels.
And with that, we'll wrap up this segment of Binge Guide. The next show, we've explored the ins and outs of Screamboat, from its public domain origins to its potential for both scares and laughs.
But before we move on, I want you to consider this. If Screamboat is successful, what other public domain characters would you like to see get the horror comedy treatment?
It's a thought-provoking question, and one that we'll revisit in our final segment.
Welcome back to Binge Guide. The next show, we've spent this episode dissecting Screamboat, a film that's definitely pushing boundaries and sparking conversation.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating deep dive exploring the intersection of horror comedy, nostalgia, and public domain law. And as we head into our final thoughts,
Yeah.
I want to touch on something we brought up earlier, that sense of unease that comes from seeing childhood icons twisted into something dark and sinister.
Yeah, it's a bit like that feeling you get when you revisit a beloved childhood toy
Right.
and realize it's not quite as magical as you remember, except in this case. It's Steamboat Willie wielding a bloody cleaver instead of a whistle.
Exactly. And there's something about that contrast, that subversion of our expectations, that taps into like a primal fear. It's like the foundation of our childhood memories is being shaken.
It really makes you wonder, like, why we're so drawn to this kind of unsettling imagery.
Right.
Is it a way of confronting our own anxieties about the loss of innocence, or is it just a morbid fascination with the taboo?
I think it's a bit of both. We're simultaneously repelled and intrigued by the idea of something pure becoming corrupted.
Yeah.
And in the case of Screamboat, there's also that element of satire,
Right.
It's not just about scaring us, it's also about making us question our relationship with these iconic characters and the corporations that control them.
So is Screamboat a brilliant work of social commentary disguised as a horror comedy? Or is it just a fun, bloody romp designed to exploit our nostalgia?
That's the beauty of it. It could be all of those things. And I think that's what's going to make it such a polarizing film. Some people will be horrified, some will be amused, and some will be left scratching their heads.
But one thing's for sure, it's a movie that's going to get people talking. And it could very well open the floodgates for more public domain characters to get the horror treatment.
Which brings us back to the question we posed earlier. If this trend continues, which character would you be most terrified to see get the Screamboat treatment?
Ooh, that's a chilling thought, personally. I'm not sure I'm ready to see a homicidal Tony the Tiger on the loose.
I hear you on that one, but that's what makes this whole concept so fascinating. It forces us to confront our own nostalgia and the darker possibilities that lurk beneath the surface of our childhood memories.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Screamboat, we encourage you to keep an open mind, embrace the absurdity, and maybe even have a few nightmares about murderous cartoon characters.
And remember, if you're looking for your next cinematic obsession binge guide, the next show is here to guide you through the ever-expanding world of movies. Until next time, happy watching.